Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Soul School tonight. I am, at least at the moment, your host. There she is.
I am.
Okay.
I'm sorry. Issues.
Okay.
Over. I'm here.
Oh, good. I was gearing up. I was like, okay, I got this. But there you are. I knew you'd come through. Yeah.
It's all good. Yeah. Bill's probably, behind the curtain having a nervous breakdown, which is kind of funny. But is class in session, my darling? How late am I?
You're like 10 seconds. I didn't even get to it yet, so you're not that late.
Okay.
So I'll let you do the honors.
Okay, well, class is in session, and I'm so flustered. You're going to need to remind me what we're doing the show about tonight. Just, you know what? Just, if you could, Bill, if you're there, pull me down, let Jeff do the honors, and I'll be back in 2 minutes, okay?
All right. Okay. Well, it's always something, right? It's always exciting around here. Well, Andrea and I had talked earlier in the week, and I know it's been a long week for the both of us, so we didn't really get to do our normal little mini conference via text that we typically do. But I had just simply said that I'd had in my heart and on my mind all this week, something that we were talking about at the tail end of last week's show, which is the concept of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. And we talked about this in a certain context last week. We specifically, I think, and I think it was last week, sometimes these conversations run together, but Andrea had asked me about my time as well when I was a more fundamentalist Christian, and I was a pastor. For those of you who don't know me, I think probably most who tune into the show do, that I was a pastor in a denominational church for about 12 years, and I was a rather fundamentalist, hardline preacher and pastor. And I lost my faith for a season, and I became an atheist. And I'd say, for all suits and purposes, for about 2 years where I was. And Andrea had asked me about that, and then we kind of got into the issue, the Hegelian dialectic, as it's called, which is basically the concept of how ideas are presented or held initially, challenged, and then how the initial idea and the challenge synthesize and come together to form a new idea. So that's the concept of thesis, antithesis, synthesis. Okay. So the idea is that we all start off with a thesis. We start off with a general, untested idea about life and about reality, about how it works, about how it functions. And then at some point in our journey, we encounter the antithesis, the antithesis of our thesis, and our thesis is challenged, and oftentimes it's dissolved, right? And in that dissolution, we often find ourselves, disillusioned, and we find ourselves sort of floating in the void of nothingness and unknowing, and what feels and can feel like non-being, and not knowing who we are, or where we are, or what we are to do, or where we are to go. We kind of go through this season of real lostness and wandering when we encounter antithesis. And that process of dissolving the thesis, that process or that experience of having everything that we thought we knew reduced and boiled down and dissolved, it's meant to, and when I say meant to, that suggests a larger plan. So I'm assuming something there that maybe not everybody assumes, right? But I think it's meant to bring us to a point of synthesis, where the thesis that we were going to discard upon discovery of the antithesis, those two things sort of come back together and they form something new that didn't exist prior to the union of opposites, the coincidentia oppositorum, which you hear me say that alchemical phrase a lot in this show because it's a concept that I really love. So we started talking about that last week, and we started talking about it in the concept or in the context of, my belief system that experienced a little bit more than a challenge. It was completely dissolved, and how I came around to where I'm at now. And we talked about how Andrea was more of the existentialist school of thought, and then sort of went away from that and now kind of came back to it, but how it's something different because there's been the synthesis of these two things. So one of the things that I suggested we talk about this week is that we revisit those ideas. And Andrea will be joining us again soon. For those of you who are wondering if it's just me and if you should tune out, no, she will be back. But I suggested that we take a look at the concept of something that's called transcend and include, and that we do it in the context of that larger subject. So, I hate to get into it too much without, oh, there she is. Okay.
Yeah, Bill just left me a message that I need an atomic clock. He's such an ass. If he lived closer, I'd have to kick it. But, he's like, 1,000 miles away.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm back. I'm sorry.
No, you're good.
So what are we talking about tonight? Don't freeze up on me, Jeff. Don't even.
Yeah.
Freeze up on me.
See, because you froze up on me, so I'm not sure where it's coming from.
It's definitely you. I've got high speed internet, 500.
Okay. No, we said that we were we're talking about the concept of transcend and include, and I was kind of laying the groundwork a little bit from what we talked about last week.
Yeah,
which was thesis, antithesis, synthesis, or at least that's what we kind of started talking about at the end, right?
Mm-hmm.
We talked about the idea of thesis, which is the kind of like naive initial perception we have of reality about life and our general view of how things work, how reality works. It's untested because how can it be anything but untested, because we've not experienced enough of life to have had it tested. Mm-hmm. And then our thesis meets its antithesis, its antithesis. And in that place, the thesis is often is dissolved into the antithetical. It often consumes it, and we find ourselves oftentimes in this place of complete loss. It might be a crisis of faith.
Disillusionment.
Complete disillusionment. It can manifest itself in a lot of different ways depending on what you grew up in. If you grew up in an atheistic environment and you maybe encounter something that opens you up to the transcendent, it can be experienced the same way. It's whatever you grew up as, or you had as your thesis, your initial understanding about how reality worked. When that's challenged and it's dissolved, you experience a kind of disillusionment and you find yourself sort of free floating in nothingness, not knowing what to do or where to go. You find yourself in that space of liminality where two worlds are coming together, and it's a challenging place. It's
the in between. Yeah.
The in between. It's a dark place. It's a challenging place. It's a place where, we don't necessarily know which way is up, which way is down, what's right,
it's a
what's
kind
left.
Of purgatory on earth, I think. That's how I think of it. That place that you go to where it's everything and nothing. And you don't know what's up and what's down. And it's being in the kind of place where you might even question your own sanity or your own ability to process information. And it usually hits us when we are struck by something shocking or traumatic. And it makes us question everything. So yes, I know that feeling well.
It's often an experience of the traumatic or the transcendent that shakes us out of our whatever our little bubble was. It bursts that membrane and exposes us to what always existed outside, but that we had been sort of shielded and protected from. And now all of a sudden we become aware of our vulnerability. We become aware of how small we are in a large world, because it was nice and safe and comfy in the realm of thesis, because we had it all figured out. We knew exactly what was right, what was wrong. We knew what way was forward, what way was backward. We knew what progress was. We knew what regress was. We knew what good was. We knew what evil was. Everything was very simple, very black and white, very cut and dry. very binary. But when the bubble is burst and we're exposed to the fact that we exist in a much larger reality than the one that we originally thought we lived in, and we are just exposed to the everything that is outside of the bubble, it's traumatic. Now, it's freedom. It's also freedom and liberty, because you were constrained. You were imprisoned, for lack of a better term, and now you are free. But freedom is scary, you know. And boundary, let's no boundaries is scary, you know. That's why, you know, psychologically, kids are actually more comfortable playing on a playground where there are clear boundaries. You know, whether there's a fence that marks the playground off from the outside world, or like a fence, or even an imaginary dividing line that says this is the elementary playground, this is the junior high playground, and you know, these are non-overlapping magisterium. You know, there is a comfort in that, because you know what the safe zone is, you know where you belong, you know where the borders are, it's safe. But if all of those borders are removed, there's this anxiety and this uneasiness, and kids aren't as comfortable engaging in play with one another in an environment without boundaries and borders.
Yeah, it's like when you're a child,
when you're young. That's why
we have a coloring book and crayons, and we try so hard to color inside the lines, and we are encouraged to color inside the lines, because that I think promotes something that is innate, that is integral to humanity, and that is that we have a very marked tendency to compartmentalize everything, to put it in its own little file drawer for future reference. And then when you realize that with the stroke of your crayon, you're coloring outside the lines, and that behind the picture that was just drawn in black and white stick figures, you can create a whole background, you know, change the whole atmosphere of what you're doing. It's freeing, liberating, creative, and scary.
It is. But you have to have the lines before you can learn to color outside of them. Right. If you're given a coloring book without lines, you're not really given a coloring book. You're given a blank tablet of paper. So the lines are what give you the conception of the fact that you can create things. You can put lines on paper that represent, you know, a house with a sunshine and clouds, you know, whereas if all you're given is paper and you never see the lines, you don't know how to create those things. So you're given the boundaries initially, and you learn to color within them. And then eventually you have an art class where you're given a blank sheet of paper. You're like, okay, now create. And you learn to create in the void by having learned to create within boundaries. So I just disappeared into the void on my screen. So I'm hoping, am I there? Can you hear me? Okay. Right as I said into the void, it went black and the little circle was spinning. I was like, oh great. Okay.
We can see you fine. Yeah.
Okay. So we learn through boundaries how to operate in the realm of boundarylessness. But even then, when we're operating in the realm of boundarylessness, what we end up doing is coming back to a place where we are creating boundaries in the realm of no boundaries. By creating, we are naturally creating new boundaries, but the new boundaries we're creating are a synthesis of what we learned in the realm of boundaries and in the realm of boundarylessness. Now, both of those things are coming together so that we can actually create something. So that's the synthesis of the thesis and the antithesis. That's where they come together, where you actually learn now how to create your own boundaries on the blank page that you couldn't have learned had you not been initially handed a coloring book with lines and boundaries, and then learned what it is to create without them. Well, once you start creating, you are naturally creating boundaries. So that's the synthesis of the two things. So it's not just boundaries and no boundaries. It's how do we bring these things together to create something new? And that's kind of how it emerges. And so in my case, my boundaries that I grew up with were Christianity, you know, and a very specific form of Christianity. I wouldn't say the kind that I was raised in was necessarily a strict fundamentalist kind. in theory it is, and if you follow it out to its logical conclusion, it is, but that's not the way that it was practiced in my family and in my home. My parents were very generous and very kind, very forgiving, very gracious and merciful in their approach to Christianity. I have a personality that borders on the obsessive. So when I took it on as my own belief system, I was going to follow it out to its logical end. I wasn't going to hang out at the edges and just kind of have this as like my casual Sunday morning identity. I was going to live it with everything that I could. And in living it as passionately as I could, I found out that that particular form really is just not sustainable. It can't be lived out to its full logical conclusion by someone who's actually trying to. It can't. You can't survive that. It's too intense. You know, the human soul and psyche will break under that pressure. And mine did. And that was where my thesis met its antithesis. When I came to that point where I was like, oh, this doesn't really work when faced with these sorts of problems, or when faced with reality when it's wearing this shade of gray. And so that was where my faith dissolved, right? So that was where the boundaries went down. And now I found myself in this place of like, oh shit, what do I do now? You know, and really that's what it felt like. It was just like, I was so used to very clearly defined borders between this thing and that thing, forward and backward, up and down, black and white, left and right. Everything was very clear and very binary. And all of a sudden I found myself floating in the blank page. I found myself floating in the, you know, the inky black waters of the void, you know, of boundarylessness. And I was like, what do I do here? What do I do now? I don't know how to pray here. I don't know how to serve here. I don't know how to be, you know, husband or father or any of those things here, because everything I knew how to do, I knew how to do in the context of my thesis. And now my thesis has been mowed down by the 18-wheeler of antithesis. Mm-hmm. And I don't know how to live anymore. I don't know what to do anymore, because everything was rooted in this. And that's why in the beginning to Will to Power, Nietzsche talks about the concept of the death of God, and how the death of God would eventually hit the Western mind when it actually took root. You know, the whole idea that through science and reason and rationalism, we kind of put down the notion of God. We put that old horse out of its misery, so to speak, and we let it go. And he was like, well, and in the gay science, he symbolically, you know, has a madman show up, who's called the madman because he's holding a lantern during the daytime, which you don't need lanterns during the day because you have the sun. And he's going around saying, you know, I'm looking for God. And they're like, oh, you're looking for God, are you? And he's like, these were the atheists of the age who were like, oh, you're looking for God. And they begin to like mock him. And he's like, oh, you don't know. He's like, God is dead and we've killed him. And there's not enough water to wash away the blood and to conceal the crime that we've committed. And they're laughing at him and mocking at him because in their mind, they're like, this fool looking for God. He came with a lantern during the day because he had expected the darkness that would fall in the aftermath of the death of God to already be present, but it wasn't there yet. So he says, thunder and lightning take time. You know, the thunder, there's sometimes a delay between, you know, the sound of the thunder and the flash of the lightning, depending on how close you are to the storm. And he's like, so we're not close enough to the event to where you're hearing the thunder of the lightning flash or seeing the darkness that results from the blotting out of the sun. So his concept was like, once we have killed this concept of God, and that can look like something in your own individual life. He's like, everything that was attached to it, all of the values, the life you lived, the way you lived your life, all of that was attached to that sinking ship, when it goes down, those all go with it because they were attached to it. Because that's how we've set up the system. And so then you're going to find yourself questioning everything. Because if the thing that was like the most important, most sure, steadfast thing in the world and in the universe sank like a stone, you're going to find yourself wondering, well, what about my marriage? What about, my profession? What about the things that I've taken on as my passion and what about all these things? I was wrong about that. How can I be sure I'm right about these? And it really puts you in quite a place, you know? And some choose to stay there. Some enjoy the nihilism of that, you know, and they just enjoy the feeling of like, well, F it, I guess nothing means anything and everything is meaningless. So let's just let's just enjoy it. And Nietzsche actually talked about a sort of nihilist who actually would put his shoulder to the plow and aid in the decomposition of the world by embracing a sort of nihilism. But of course, even as a total atheist, non-Christian, anti-Christian, in his own words, that was not his prescription for what we should do at all. But you can, in that place, it's a place where you experience and you face down things. You didn't face down in the land of Thesis. You face down darkness here. You face down things in yourself that you didn't know were there, because in this place you have to survive. We were just watching the movie Life of Pi. In fact, my wife and son are still watching it right now. It's probably I think it's easily my favorite movie. I can't get through it without crying.
I know, me either. I watched it once and once only, just like Schindler's List. Once and once only. I can never watch it again, nor do I need to, because I think every frame of that film is seared into my memory.
Right, and that's how it's meant to be, because even the name Life of Pi is the hypothetical number that extends infinitely, right? 3.14 ad infinitum. And that's the nickname of the kid in the movie. And of course, pi, which is this infinite number, is symbolized by the Greek symbol for pi. And that's also a metaphor for the whole story, because it's a symbol that has infinite meaning to it. And that's the whole point of the movie, that every frame, even in the actual movie itself, there is like infinite meaning, even in just the frames, the cinematography. It's mind-blowingly beautiful.
It is.
But one of the symbols that's present in the movie, one of the symbols that's present there is you have this young kid, Pi, who his mother is a very religious woman and a vegetarian, according to her particular religious proclivities. The father is not religious, and he's specifically not a vegetarian. He's more of an atheistic person who you can tell he did what he had to do in life to survive. And Pi, the son, is torn between these two worldviews and ways of, seeing things. He grows up in a zoo, which is sort of supposed to be like a Garden of Eden symbolically. And then he has to leave Eden when the parents sell the zoo and move to Canada. And they're transporting all the animals with them on a boat that's called, of all things, the Simsum, Tsimtsum, which in Lurianic Kabbalah means reduction, or the place where God reduces his presence so that we can actually experience life, where actual chaos and trouble can touch us, so that we grow and we actually mature and become who we're supposed to be without him hovering over us like a helicopter parent, protecting us from everything. That's what the word Simsum means. And that's, of all things, the name of the vessel they're traveling on, right? Spoiler alert for anyone who hasn't seen the movie. I should have said that up front. Seriously, spoiler alert. So then that ship sinks in the movie. And the mother and the father representing these two perspectives on reality, a kind of nihilistic survivalism and religious, supernatural wonder at the world. They both go down in the boat, and the son remains. And that represents, I think, the fact that these two things now have to synthesize and come together in this young man. And, there's the whole story. I won't go into it all, but, some of the animals that they were transporting end up on the boat with him, and it's symbolic. One of the animals is a tiger that is named Richard Parker, who kind of hides under this tarp in the boat and only emerges when Pi, the young man, needs it to survive in a moment. And the whole point is Richard Parker and Pi are the same thing. And Richard Parker, the tiger, is the part of this kid that comes alive in order to help him survive. And that's because he's floating in the ocean. He's in the place of Simsum, the in-between, where God's reduced God's presence to let chaos touch us so we can grow and come forth. And that's one of the things that needed to grow and come forth in Pi, is this part of his nature to survive. And anyways, that's like the point. When you're in that place, when you're in that void, when you're in the open ocean, some of those things come out of you. You have to learn to survive, But what's happening all along is those two parental figures that sank to the bottom of the ocean symbolically are synthesizing and coming together in you. So you're in the place of antithesis here. You've left the garden, but the point is merging these two so you can see both the purity and the power of the mother's faith and the necessity that the father of survival that the father showed him, that both of these things are needed and necessary and have to come together. So that it was just providential that they were watching it when I came home from dropping my daughter off, because I had already planned on talking about some of this stuff. And it just, I want to, when this is done, I'm going to watch it again, because I was like half in tears coming back here to like do the show. I was just like, oh, that movie just hits me. Anyways, but it reminded me too of even the concept of Eden, because we started hitting on this last week, and how we talked about the symbolism of the Garden of Eden. And though I consider myself a Christian, I don't take the Garden of Eden story literally. And I think it's pretty obvious it's not meant to be taken literally from the way that it's composed. But in the story of the Garden of Eden, some of the imagery there that's so rich and powerful is that you have these two individuals who are essentially created like children. They're naked, we're told, and they don't feel ashamed. And Genesis 1 is one account of creation, and then Genesis 2 and 3 is another account of creation. We in the English Bible put them together as though they're one story, but it's actually a compilation of two different stories, Genesis 1 and then Genesis 2 and 3, from two different hypothetical sources. But in Genesis 2 and 3, it says of Adam and Eve that they were naked and they felt no shame. And then the very next line, which it's divided between, 2 and 3 are divided as though it's chapters, but in the Hebrew Bible, there are no chapter divisions. Those were added for our convenience, but they don't exist in the original manuscripts. So when it says they were naked and they felt no shame, the very next line in Genesis 3 is, but the serpent was more cunning or shrewd than any of the other creatures that the Lord had made. So, interesting, because the word naked and the word for shrewd or crafty are almost identical. They're homonymous, they're homonyms. So they rhyme and they essentially mean the same thing. And the biblical writers weren't idiots. They knew what they were doing, and they knew why they knew how to use words and whatever. So the fact that it says they were naked and felt no shame, and then it says the serpent was also the most, in a sense, the most naked of all the creatures the Lord God had made, but that word can also mean shrewd or cunning. So this is interesting. Why would the serpent be the most naked and therefore be the most shrewd or cunning? Well, what do snakes do continuously? Shed their skins. So the serpent is constantly shedding its skin. Therefore, it is the creature who is the most acquainted with nakedness or casting off its garment, because that's what it does regularly, right? So symbolically, it's the most naked of all the creatures the Lord's made. And there's deep symbolism there, because it's constantly casting off its garment. It's acquainted with nakedness, and this has made it shrewd and crafty. Adam and Eve, on the other hand, are naked and are ignorant concerning their nakedness. They don't really even know that they are. The serpent knows that he's naked, and he's come to understand that this is something that can be used to take advantage of others, right? So the nakedness here represents vulnerability in a sense. You're naked walking around a garden, you're vulnerable. And Adam and Eve are vulnerable, but they're unaware. They're not ashamed. They're not concerned. They're not really thinking about the fact that stuff's hanging out, and there's a lot that could go wrong. They're not really, they're naive.
Essentially pure. They're essentially as pure as a newborn baby.
Yeah. And they don't think like, oh, there's something out there that would take advantage of this, or, attack me because I'm not shielded or covered. They don't think that way about the world. In their mind, everything's friendly. Everything is rainbows and unicorns and lollipops with some sprinkles and chocolate chips, and that's just the world. They live in like the world is like the candy commercial that used to come on before the movies in the 80s, where there's just popcorn, and that's the world they live in. The serpent, though, is well acquainted with his own vulnerability, because he's always shedding his skin. He knows what this is all about, and he knows how to take advantage of others who are in the same position, but who are ignorant concerning just how much danger that they're in. And so the serpent uses that against them and deceives them, in essence. And so what happens then right after once they eat, like, I won't go into the whole story, but they eat of a fruit God says not to eat of. It's the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil. And it's not that God was never going to allow them to eat from that tree and eat that fruit. It's simply that kind of knowledge is earned. That's the kind of knowledge you ease your way into. You don't have it thrust on you all at once, or it will break you. To just have the knowledge of good and evil opened up to you the way that it's open to God, we can't all handle that, right? And it'll break you when you see it. When you just see that clear distinction between good and evil, it will break you if you're not ready for it. And that's what happens to Adam and Eve. And the serpent knows this will break them, and it will cause symbolically death and estrangement. And so once they see it, they also realize they're naked. They realize how vulnerable they are. And they immediately seek to cover it with fig leaves, right? And then God comes to them and long story short, gives them new garments to cover themselves that are made of animal skins. Now, if a garment is made of animal skins, that means there had to be a death in order for you to be covered with these skins, right? Unless you're a serpent, animals don't just go around volunteering their flesh for us to cover ourselves with. So it, symbolically speaking, I think what's being communicated is, here's what's happened to you. You were taken advantage of, okay? You were ignorant about how vulnerable you were, and you were taken advantage of by one who was not. And now you've realized that you've tried to cover, but what you've tried to cover yourself with is ultimately not, it's not what's going to happen. Because what happens when you partake of this kind of knowledge in the state that you're in is the one thing that you will constantly be covering yourself with is violence. That's why they're covered with death instead of foliage. Because in this state, this is what you will constantly be covering yourself with, is death and violence. And so right after that, we're told Cain and Abel, the sons of Adam and Eve, Cain rises up against Abel and kills him out of jealousy. That's a layer, another layer he puts around himself to protect himself. Cain is removed from Eden. He goes off into another region, and it says he builds a city. The building of that city is another garment he puts around himself. It's just these layer upon layer upon layer of protection that we're putting on to try to protect ourselves from that which we know we are vulnerable to attack from. And it always looks like violence. It always looks like death, garments of skin and death. And that's what happens. I've gotten a little way off topic now, but I kind of feel like maybe there's something in here that maybe is relevant. So that's kind of what happens.
Also mention the whole notion of imbued within humanity is are some essential and I think innate traits. And one of them is the proclivity for temptation, answering the call of temptation. Being curious and fascinated, and like any child will do when told, no, don't do that, is the first thing that they'll do when the authorities got its back turned.
Yeah, absolutely. And and like I said, and then there are those out there who know, and they're typically not the ones you think, they're typically not. And this is, look, man, I was a naive individual growing up. I grew up in a bubble. I grew up in Eden. I grew up with two parents who were to this day, if the most saintly, holy, godly, perfect people on this planet to me are my parents. Despite any disagreement we've ever had, they are perfection in my eyes. I really cannot even look back and see one thing they did wrong. I can't. Even when I know there's clear errors and flaws because we're all human, I still look at it through very rose-tinted glasses because they are just pure love and like self-sacrifice and self-giving. They've taught me everything I know about that. And I grew up in Eden. I was very naive about what the world was like out there. And I'm very trusting. I always have been very trusting. My dad,
I'm trusting to the point of gullible.
Yeah. And I've been there. And my dad always tried to, without making us Okay, so without giving us the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil, that just opens our eyes and shows us how horrible things are. My dad lived a different kind of life growing up. He was in a different kind of family. He had a rougher, 20s. His 20s were rough before he came to Christianity and really turned his life around. And so he's more aware of what goes on out in the world than I was. And he would always, he was a truck driver, so he encountered some rough characters. No offense there, but it's just a culture. And he'd always be like, just down to things like never go to a rest area after dark, never go to just all these things he would just teach me. And I'd be like, why? I don't understand. He's like, I'm not going to explain it all to you. Just trust me.
Trust me. Yeah.
There are serpents in the garden. Trust me. And, a good father doesn't just give you the fruit all at once because he knows it'll break you. It'll break your mind that is innocent and pure. Serpents are the ones who come and give you the fruit all at once. And they know you're curious about it, right? Because negative suggestion, don't. That basically says do. When you say don't think of a zebra, your brain has to formulate the image of a zebra in order to know what it is it's not supposed to think of. So you break the commandment before you even try to not break it, right? Because your brain has to think of the thing it's not supposed to think of before it can try to not think of it. So when you say don't do something in here begins to want to do it. And so then there are serpents in the garden who understand this. And they are going to try to, in one way or another, push you toward that. They're going to try to bring about situations in the world that cause your eyes to be opened before they should be opened. Just this week at my son's school, my son's a senior. It wasn't really something that was in his realm, but just this week at his school, somebody who was a bus driver, a lunchroom worker, the person that I saw every morning when I dropped him off for school, standing and greeting and letting kids in, was busted on 8 charges of terrible, terrible crimes against children.
Jesus Christ.
And it was a huge deal. And I'm like, I every day dropped my son off and watched him walk past this person and watch this person say, good morning, and reading the charges against this person. I'm like, oh my God, but those people are out there, and it's not always that extreme. But it is also that extreme. Also, one of the Christian groups that I was heavily influenced by in the late 90s and early 2000s, millions strong prayer movement in the world. It was on the day of the Hamas attacks in Israel, a day after I had this very clear sense in my mind, you are about to see evil. Get ready for it. And it was all in the context of studying Genesis and having this sense of, being exposed, having my own vulnerabilities exposed. It was all in the same context of everything I'm talking about. The next day, it came to light that this person, the person who founded this ministry that's millions strong, that was heavily influential, and I'd left it behind. I haven't thought like that in years, but even so, I still thought the person saintly, if misguided. I was exposed. They had been a sexual predator for decades, and it was one of those things that just shook me because I don't really even live according to the things they taught anymore. But still, it was like, oh my God, how gullible, how naive. And then at the same time, just seeing the sheer evil of humanity and then the retaliatory evil of humanity and just this endless cycle of violence.
Conflict and violence.
And people who are vulnerable and naked and know it and continue to cover themselves with violence, right? And why does it happen? Because in these sudden moments, the thesis of life is challenged by the knowledge of good and evil that comes in these explosions, and it breaks people, and it turns good people evil, right? It turns good people evil. It turns victims into victimizers. It happens. And I know we don't even like to use language like that, but it happens. And
it happens.
Yeah.
And going back to the cyclical nature, I for years worked with sex offenders, and every one of these boys was a victim before.
Sure, yeah.
Every single one of them was a victim before they became the perpetrator. Every one of them.
Yeah.
it's something far beyond learned behavior.
Yeah.
That kind of abuse, females process that kind of abuse very differently than males do.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and it's, you know, to perpetuate that cycle, it's almost impossible to break it.
Yeah.
It's so ingrained in human nature.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I had I had a crisis this week, um, and it's one of the things that I wanted to address with. And we've got a little bit of time left,
Yeah.
but I had a crisis this week that was very hard for me to process, and I kind of hit the wall, the stone wall of Eden, of the garden.
Mm.
And it was the attack on more than 120 people dead, 750 people wounded, because they were rushing the supply trucks in Gaza. And apparently somebody felt threatened in the IDF and just opened fire on these people. And all they were doing was reaching out with trembling hands, begging for food because they're starving to death. And someone on the other side said they're a threat when they were almost too weak
Mm-hmm.
to lift their arms up to get the food from these supply trucks, and were murdered in cold blood. And I was talking with Rupert last night, my friend Rupert. Everybody knows him, and I said, I feel like everything I do is for naught. What possible difference could I be making in the world when every day is just another chapter in, this horrifying book of life? Absolutely horrifying to me. And I told him, I said, my mother has the privilege to be home with her family, all the food she could possibly want, all the proper medications that she requires, in a cozy, cuddly, all the equipment that she needs, everything that she needs. And I have the capacity, sadly, have the capacity to imagine my precious mother in a refugee camp in southern Gaza, laying on a desert floor under a tent, if she's lucky, in sub-freezing weather, and no protection, as her, this elderly woman is seeing the last of life. And it makes me profoundly sad, but more than anything, it makes me angry that anyone should have to suffer like this, that anyone should have to suffer like this. And the thing that upsets me more than anything is that I believe, based on all the knowledge I've gained, everything I have witnessed, that this all happened and was set up to happen after the initial attack, when no one came to help. That it was just an excuse to go in and take Gaza back and level it and wipe out 2 million people, whether by disease or starvation, or just blowing them to smithereens right in their homes. Not everybody, I'm not, please don't for a moment think that I think there's anything about Hamas that isn't evil. They've well proved themselves to be monsters. But I don't know who it was that said, hell is empty and all the monsters are here on earth. But that's how I felt this week. That, I just can't take any more. I can't take any more of the knowledge of good and evil and perpetual conflict that never ever ends. It just never ends. My mom said to me, I was born into a world war and I will die in a world war. Now, she firmly believes that it's already begun, and she could very well be right. And, so we talk about this being soul school, and, what have we learned? What the hell have we learned in a lifetime, in my mother's lifetime, in 84 years? What have we learned? And honestly, Jeff, I look at the state of the world, and all I can say is nothing. We've learned nothing. We're making the same mistakes over and over and over again. And instead of being our brother's keeper, we are our brother's assassin. And that humanity doesn't deserve to inherit the earth. Leave it to the cockroaches and the rats. We don't deserve. We are so self-destructive as a race on this planet. Not only do we destroy each other at every opportunity, but we're destroying the planet upon which we dwell. And I talked to Rupert and I'm like, I give up. I just give up. I do. What's the point? What is the point? Why should I have to put a little makeup on Friday night and speak to people about, all that we talk about and all that we share when it doesn't seem to make any difference at all? And his response is, you have no idea the difference that it makes. You have no idea how far your reach.
Yeah.
And he lifted me up out of the depths of despair for humanity and for all the creatures on this planet. And, said, save one soul.
Yeah.
Reach out and help one person, just one. And your whole life will have been of value beyond measure. Well, I know I've done better than that in my 65 years, and so have you. So, what do we do, Jeff? Do we just, and if we can't stop or even mitigate the conflict, if we can't do anything except identify it and mourn about it, and know that nothing's going to change, it's just going to get worse, then why even have this outlet? What's the point?
This is how I try to live my life. As above, so below. Which means the larger picture ultimately is shaped like the smaller picture. That's what fractals teach us. Fractals teach us that the larger reality is made up of the smaller reality. And so what I do in miniature every day contributes to the collective shape of reality.
The greater good.
It is. And all we can do is, number one, start with ourselves. And we can we have to have a large, big view of everything. We have to look through the telescope and see how big everything is. But then we also have to look through the microscope and realize that large things are made up of very small things. And if we try to fix the big things, we'll end up getting so frustrated that we stop tending to the small things. But if we all tend to the small things, those become large things. And, there's a great scene. It's probably one of my favorite TV shows of all time is the first season of the HBO show True Detective. And it's not everybody's cup of tea. It's definitely not everybody's cup of tea. But at the very end of it, let's just say it's grisly and gruesome, and there's a lot of things that happens, but it's a very deep and existential, look into humanity. And at the end, the two main characters, again, spoiler alert, have stared into the void and seen all sorts of things that no one should ever see. And one is wheeling another out of the hospital in a wheelchair, and they look up at the sky, and it's mostly dark, and there's a few stars. And the one who's just so now beaten up and bitter and jaded at everything he's seen just comments on the fact that there's more darkness than there is light, and how impossible it seems that light will ever prevail. And then the character who's been the most pessimistic throughout the show looks at him and says, "You're wrong about that." He's like, "Once upon a time, there was only dark. It seems to me that the light is winning." The fact that there is any light in the sky at all, when once upon a time all there was darkness, says the light's winning. Because it's not stopping. It's continually coming and it's growing. And as with the death of God, where Nietzsche said in the negative, the results of this negative thing are going to take time to manifest themselves, so the results of positive things take time as well. Lightning strikes, depending on how close you are to the event, determines how quickly you hear the thunder. And so the good that you do, the good that I do, the good that everyone watching and viewing does, whether it's something as simple as you wake up in the morning and you choose to stay on the planet for one more day, because God knows sometimes that's the hardest thing to do. And if then on top of it, you choose to stay on the planet, you choose to love and serve someone other than yourself when you're in a place where you're healthy enough to do so, good God, you're doing more than most ever get around to in 10 lifetimes. And if on top of that, you go out and whatever, I mean, those things aren't small things. They are small things. No, I'll take it back. They're small things. But small things become massive things when we all practice them together. And what you and I do, what you and Rupert do, what everyone is doing in their own individual ways, is we're calling people to take hold of the small things, to love yourself, to love others, to serve others, to do what you can to brighten up the small corner of the world that you live in, to light a match, to light a torch, to light a signal fire eventually. And eventually, if we all do that, we light up the world. And the fact is, there was once only darkness, and the fact that there's any light at all shows that the light is winning and the light is growing. And it's so easy to get discouraged when you get consumed by the macro. Good God. But as above, so below.
Well, I think that we all live, whether we want to admit it or not, we all live in quiet desperation.
Mm-hmm.
All of us do.
Yep.
Trying to find our way out of the darkness and into the light, trying to ascend spiritually, learning very, very painful lessons from the incredibly difficult tests that we are tasked with.
Mm-hmm.
And if I could humbly suggest what you just said, just showing up in Soul School every day is, and you get a car, and you get a car, and here's your, you get a badge, and you get and here's a fresh pencil, and there's your gold star, I mean, it is just being brave enough to live one more day on this fucked up planet, in this fucked up society, and to still find reason for being and reason for being happy is maybe one of the lessons that we learn, that no matter how bad, just keep going. What Churchill said, when you're going through hell, just keep going. And I don't know the philosopher who said that if God did not exist, man would have been forced to invent him. Got to wrap. Okay, you know, Bill, where's my 1 minute? Get your damn atomic clock going. You're supposed to give me 1 minute so I can say goodbye. All right, we have to wrap.
Okay.
Which, you know, I mean, and it's not even Christmas Eve, and we have to wrap.
Yeah, it could be with my tree up still.
It could be. It could be. I love you, darling, sweetheart.
You too.
I love you. Go watch Life of Pi and class dismissed.
Yes.